In 2015, a writer named Anna Garvey wrote a short article about the Oregon Trail generation. Unlike many articles that make broad statements about generations, this one had a good point and was not just a glib think piece. It pointed out that for people born between about 1975 and 1985, we had an interesting relationship with technology. We were exposed to it at an early age, but it wasn't omnipresent as it was to people born just a few years later. Along with that, the perceived economic and emotional value of electronics changed from when I was a young child to my teen years. In some ways, this allows me to understand a common point of misunderstanding between boomers and older Generation X members, and on the other hand, millennials. Often, people's subjective understanding of how valuable things are is set at an early age, and later, it is hard to change those things, even when presented with objective data. So let me say one thing that is obvious, to me at least. Electronics, up through the end of the 1980s, were expensive and not common. To bolster my subjective impressions, let's look at some prices from the era between 1975 to 1985. I don't know 100% how representative these prices are, but they seem pretty standard. At the time, a VCR would cost between $1,000 and $1,400. Early home computers were similarly priced, between $1,000 and $14, with the Commodore being cheap, starting at $300. Stereos could cost anywhere between a few hundred and over $1,000. A portable television might cost $600. And of course, a 10 megabyte hard drive costs between $3,000 and $4,000. Those numbers seem really big, but let's put them in context, comparing them to what rents would have been like in 1980. Unsurprisingly, it is hard to find an exact definitive source for how much rents were in 1980 and how much they are now. But even without perfect data, the pattern is pretty obvious. The sources I found from the US Census, iProperty Management, and Statista cite an apartment rental cost of between $200 and $300 for the year 1980. This is between 60 and 100 hours of work at minimum wage, but let's put it in terms of electronics. A VCR would worth 3 months average rent, a home computer might be up to 6 months average rent, a stereo would be 3 or 4 months rent, and a portable television would be 2. To compare that to the price of electronics today, I'm going to look at the price of my own electronics that I have in my home right now. This is my Casio SA46 keyboard synthesizer, 2.5 octaves. That cost me about $50. Here's my field microscope. Worked through my cell phone, takes pretty good miniature pictures, also cost me about $50. And my flip phone. I keep a flip phone in reserve, track phone. This cost me all of $30, and I think I pay like $25 for 3 months service. This is my Victrola. Little suitcase model, cost me $50. And my Nikon. This camera is not the best camera, but it's very sturdy. It's water and shock proof, so I can take it out. Cost me, I think, $150 or $180. This is my laptop, used. Runs Linux. I think it cost $120. Over to the side, we have a removable hard drive, 1 terabyte. About $80. Then we have a USB hub. You know, there's other odds and sods like my headphones. So altogether, if I add up the price of all the electronics I have in my house, we have $100, $130, $250, $350, $400. And of course, there's this cell phone itself. I believe I paid about $100 for it. So all my electronics together, I would say, cost me about $500. As you can see, my collection of electronics, which is neither large nor small, cost me about $500 in total. Without giving away too much personal information, that is around 2 weeks' rent for me. It is not really possible to convert these into the prices of 1980 because besides the turntable, the equipment is so different. For example, my terabyte hard drive at prices of $300 a megabyte would have cost me $30 million. But let's take a look at then current prices for a good quality camera that took video, stereo system, computer, VCR, and TV. Since I can watch TVs on my computer, it counts as a VCR and TV. The price of all these things together would have been $6,000 more or less. Or easily close to 2 years median rent for the early 1980s. So to get back to my original point, I didn't write this to slam older generations, but to explain something. In the 1980s, electronics were luxuries, and along with the price, were hard to find. Before the breakup of AT&T, which if you have a few hours, you should go and research, getting a new phone was slightly more involved of a project than getting minor surgery, and only slightly less complicated than getting married. So when someone who was an adult before that time sees a young person casually buying a phone, it seems extravagant, even after the math is explained. To give another example, and shifting gears slightly, in 1980, my local community college, Lane Community College, would have charged $15 for a credit hour, or $45 for a class. Currently, it is $126 a credit hour, or $378 for a class. Back in 1980, taking a community college class would be around 10% the price of a cheap computer. Today, it is almost twice the price of an average Chromebook laptop, which of course is much more powerful than a computer from 1980. But to people who reached adulthood at that time, mentioning taking a single community college class might seem like a cheap and practical way to spend money, while buying a new laptop might seem like an extravagance. Even for me, born in 1979, sometimes it is hard to wrap my head around these numbers. In my early childhood, VCRs and microwaves were luxuries, and the sudden appearance of portable cassette players and video game systems in my early teen years seemed incredible. Even when I started community college in 1996, a full term, let alone a class, was still much cheaper than one of the clunky, slow desktop computers of the time. So my message to millennials is, when baby boomers complain about young people and their smartphones and Netflix and X stations, remember that they grew up thinking of electronics as luxuries, because they were. And for baby boomers, my advice is to go and check out the math of what prices are now and realize that for young people, even cutting-edge electronics are a small fraction of what we pay for housing or education or healthcare, but that's another subject entirely. As a final addendum, in this video I talked about the disconnect with today's economic realities by people who were young adults in the early 1980s. But as I discussed in an earlier video, much of the political authorities in the US were already older adults by that point. We have only had one president of the US who grew up with television. I believe that the disparities in experience between much of the political and economic authorities in the US and the life of young people today is hard to reconcile, even when people are well-intentioned. The Oregon Trail generation is rapidly approaching their 50s, and yet their experience is still not addressed as mainstream economic and technological reality.